Two Palestinian women are sitting in a coffee shop. They are reminiscing over pictures of their children when they were younger. First woman says, "Ah, look, this is my Mohammed. He will be 24 years old now." The other woman says, "This is my Ahmed. He will be 21. The other woman says back, "Ah, but this is our little Khalid. He's only 10 now, but we hope he'll be a martyr just like his brother soon." Ah, but they blow up so quickly, don't they? I have just placed before you the seminal difference between Israel and her enemies, and the question of how Israel conducted herself during the Gaza war is simply a question of right and wrong. On September 15th, 2009, South African Judge Richard Goldstone delivered a report to the United Nations Human Rights Council condemning Israel and the radical terrorist group Hamas for war crimes during the Operation Cast-led invasion of Gaza. You may have noticed that I always wear my American flag pin on the lapel of my jacket, because I feel that this is how I can show my patriotism and national pride. Lately, I've also taken to wearing the Israeli flag as well, because I think it is our duty as Americans to stand up for those who value human life and who stand up for freedom and democracy. Israel has the right and solemn duty to protect their own people from terrorist attacks, like any sovereign nation. Thus, when Israel found its own towns and cities regularly shelled by Gazan explosives, the IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Forces, felt compelled to put a stop to it. They invaded the Gaza and defeated the terrorists who endangered Israeli citizens. So how did Israel come to be in this position? The current residents of Gaza were the Palestinian refugees after the Six-Day War in 1967. They were displaced people coming primarily from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. In the 40 years since, the Palestinians have agitated to destroy the State of Israel and create their own country. After many attempts at a diplomatic solution, Israel finally decided to give the Gaza Strip and the West Bank of the Jordan River to the Palestinians in 1994. Lately, in the winter of 2008, Hamas terrorists launched rockets deep into Israeli territory, violating a pre-existing ceasefire treaty. Israeli fighter pilots conducted surgical airstrikes, knocking out many terrorist bases in the Gaza Strip. Operation Cast-led was the IDF land invasion of Gaza to stop Hamas rocket fire. After intense street fighting, the Israelis had subdued the terrorists and rocket fire had ceased. In October of this past year, the Goldstone report made accusations of war crimes against both Israel and Hamas, and recommended a full UN investigation. But the investigation was one-sided, which left Israel publicly condemned. This was a major blow to both the State of Israel and the Jewish people. Jews across the world cried out against Goldstone as a traitor. Israel had been attacked by Hamas, and in defending itself, had brought on the condemnation of the world. Just as Israel would never stand for such ill treatment by the world community, Israel should not as well. As Americans, we should reject the Goldstone report and continue to support Israel as our ally. It fundamentally violates Israel's right as a sovereign nation to defend itself. Also, Israel has made the most extensive precautions to save civilian lives. And finally, the report calls for an equal investigation of both Hamas and Israel, but only Israel is taken a global beating. The first reason that the Goldstone report should be rejected is that it violates Israel's right as a sovereign nation to defend itself. As a sovereign nation, recognized by a majority of UN members, Israel has the right to defend itself against both sovereign and terrorist entities. Israel had, in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, it is stated that, open quote, "Nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations, until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security." End quote. This means that until, or if, as the case may be, the UN mediates the conflict, they cannot stop a nation from defending itself. As Americans, we cannot endorse this restriction of a nation's right to defend itself against terrorists. Under the circumstances, the U.S. would have done the same to stop terrorist attacks against Americans. I interviewed my Hebrew teacher, Rabbi Dov Lerner from Gratz College. He said the following, which truly exemplifies the issue. Open quote, Had there been a terrorist group right across the border in Canada, firing missiles into the U.S., President Obama would have given the order to invade within 10 seconds. Maybe with Bush 3 seconds." End quote. Likewise, when hijackers crashed 2 planes into the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, the U.S. immediately mobilized and hunted down the evil men responsible. Whether you believe that President Bush handled this well or not, no one can say that even the most pacifist of presidents would not have immediately responded with force. We have never withstood such assault, so why should Israel? Yet, Israel has been attacked on all sides throughout its relatively short history, yet it has always attempted a diplomatic solution. For this, they should be praised rather than condemned. The second reason that the Goldstone Report should be rejected is that Israel has taken extensive measures to save civilian lives. In October, British Colonel Richard Kemp said the following to the UN Human Rights Council in response to the Goldstone Report, that from his, open quote, knowledge of the IDF, and from the extent of which I followed the current operation, I don't think that there has ever been a time in the history of warfare when any army has made more efforts to reduce civilian casualties and deaths of innocent people than the IDF is doing today in Gaza. End quote. I interviewed Avi Weber, who was an IDF soldier in Gaza during Operation Cast Lead, and asked him about the precautions that Israel had taken to save civilian lives. He described how the IDF sent text messages to civilians to warn them where the bombings would be. He also described how the Israeli Air Force would drop delicate, almost bullets on the corners of buildings to warn the civilians that the building would be bombed so that they could get out in time. They went as far as to drop pamphlets into the streets of Gaza, warning the civilians of what areas in Gaza would be bombed so they could avoid these areas. This certainly made the bombings less effective, but it ensured that the fewest number of civilians were harmed in the process. Because of this, Israel had to attack on the ground, which caused more Israeli lives to be lost. In this way, Israel was sacrificing their own people for the sake of their enemies, an act of a truly chivalrous nature. As in its 1972 Operation Wrath of God, when the terrorist group Black September held and eventually killed the Israeli Olympic team for the Munich Olympics, Israel has consistently tried to save civilian lives. Israel made sure not to kill anyone who was innocent unless they aided those who were responsible for the massacre. In the course of this, only one innocent man was killed, which drew so much media attention, most likely for its rarity. In my opinion, Israel's actions in both the Munich massacre and the invasion of Gaza truly exemplify the old proverb, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," because they did their utmost to save civilians, even adhering to the rule of their enemies. And for this, they should be admired rather than condemned. Finally, Israel has been scrutinized and condemned far more than the far less honorable Hamas terrorists who instigated the fight. The Goldstone Report called for an equal investigation of both Israel and Hamas, yet only Israel has been internationally shunned. A UN fact-finding team was sent to Israel to investigate for war crimes, but was the same done for Hamas? Of course not. Palestinians were allowed to investigate Gaza for war crimes, and report back there, no doubt, Hamas filtered findings, which construed Hamas as the righteous crusaders, or jihadists as the case may be, against the evil Israelis. This is far from the truth. In my interview with Avi Weber, he told me about how Hamas had done horrible things to their own people in addition to acts against the Israelis. He told me a story that was shocking in its sheer evil. There was an 11-year-old Palestinian boy who was walking towards an Israeli checkpoint in Gaza with a backpack. This backpack was not filled with books or pencils, the normal things expected for a school-age boy. Instead, it was filled with 40 pounds of explosives to be detonated by cell phone. The child was not even aware that he was walking to his death, and there was a Palestinian standing 100 yards back who would do it all for him. Children walk up to the Israelis all the time, asking for things like chocolate. So how can the Israelis expect that a child would just explode? And more importantly, how can a people who would strap a bomb to an 11-year-old child be the peaceful, innocent people that they claim to be? Avi Weber also described how Hamas hid weapons in schools, hospitals, and mosques. How is hiding weapons in a holy place like a mosque glorifying God? Hamas has oppressed their own people and sacrificed their own children because they want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. How can Israel, who has taken every precaution to save civilian lives, be condemned for war crimes, while Hamas, who would strap a bomb to an innocent 11-year-old child, be praised as the defenders of freedom. In conclusion, Israel was justified in its invasion of Gaza, and it is a disgrace to the international community that they condemn such a just action. Israel has the right to defend itself as a sovereign nation, and the U.S. would have done the same to protect us from terrorist attacks. Also, Israel has done their utmost to protect civilians, and Hamas should, as was intended, be investigated equally for their own evil actions. I would like to thank you for listening to my speech, and I hope that as your sacred duty, you advocate Israel and peace and freedom in the Middle East. Thank you.